It's a decent fish too.
It's no secret to smallmouth fishermen that they know smallmouth relate to transitions. But what actually is a transition? A transition is a distinct change, abrupt change from soft to hard bottom. Smallmouth relate to transitions throughout the whole entire year, from spring, summer, and fall. But especially in spring, they can stack up in big numbers. First, let's talk about shoreline points, which are on every natural lake, reservoir, and even rivers to some extent. What happens is smallmouth start to move out of deep water. As the water starts to warm, they tend to stack up at these transitions, because there's usually, beside the transition from hard to soft bottom, guess what? Many times there's a transition in water temperature. What usually happens is, on that transition of softer bottom, it tends to warm a little bit more, and smallmouth, they start moving, they hit that transition, and they kind of stay there, little comfort zone. The day starts to warm up a little bit, sun comes out, water temperature rises, they start to move a little bit. Smallmouth will do one of two things. They'll either suspend somewhere in the water column tight to the point, at the edge of the point, or they'll hold tight to the bottom. The ones that suspend, they're going to be a little bit harder to catch, because in cold water, we're talking water temperatures under 40 degrees, guess what? You got to get, whether you're using a suspended jerk bait, a swim bait, or whatever, you got to get that bait exactly right in there, because in cold water, they don't like to rise too much to hit a bait. So what I do is I concentrate on those holding tight to that transition on the bottom. They'll kind of navigate up to the shallower water and then spread out across the shallow, whether it's a pre-spawn spawning area, rock or rubble or gravel or whatever. But these are the fish are very, very catchable. You're going to have to fish slow, use your electronics to mark the fish. I use a lot of finesse jigs, tubes, even Senkos rigged with weight, drag them along the bottom. But the key is slow and don't overreact. They're going to bite a little bit light. As the day progresses, they move out, fan across them shallows. Then you can catch them with swim baits, variety of soft plastics. Then what happens later in the day, as the water temperature drops, they kind of revert back and they migrate back down into deeper water. But that's going to tell you one thing. You get out in pre-spawn, that water is under 50 degrees. Don't start fishing shallow water early. Concentrate on transitions, because you can get a whole bunch of big fish stacked up in a small area. One of my favorite areas to fish for pre-spawn smallmouth on a river system is where a creek channel enters the main river. That's an area you can catch fish spring, summer, fall. There's always smallmouth hanging around a creek channel. But in the spring, they tend to hang around it. They don't spawn up into the creek necessarily, but usually on one side or the other of the creek, there's some kind of spawning area. It could be just a small flat, some sand, some gravel. It could be some rubble, but you could attract spawning fish. And here again, they're going to hold right on the edge of where you got some sand hitting gravel, or you have even muck hitting rock. Any kind of that hard, soft to hard bottom, you're going to attract some dandy smallmouth. Unfortunately, they tend to stay right on that transition. You usually have current coming in from the creek channel, and you have the rocks on one end. The good news is there's usually a distinct seam. If you locate the water coming out of the creek channel, entering the main river, and you see that seam in the current, most of the time, about 80% of the time, this little trick I learned over the years, that seam, there's usually some kind of rock or rubble. It could even be wood. But when you have that obstruction and you see that seam, that's where you want to cast, because those smallmouth are not going to come out of there very easily. So you're going to have to pinpoint your casting. Here again, you can use a tube, you can use a jig. You can use even a wacky worm if you don't have a lot of current. Shallow running crankbait, swim bait. You could try a variety of presentations, but don't worry about casting up to that bank. Concentrate on that seam, which is right at the transition. That's a little sleeper area where I've caught many, many big smallmouth in the spring.